Dyer took another breath to put himself at equilibrium, and then he reached out to jiggle the doorknob. Locked, of course. He reached into his coat and withdrew his revolver. Dull little thing, though its nebby butt was a good opener to those that mouthed off. He cocked the hammer, and there was no need to check if it was loaded. New instruments came ready for use. Then he took a step back, before launching forward with a kick, snapping the door ajar and splintering the door frame. Dyer's face was instantly awash with the light from pornography playing behind shatterproof glass. The obnoxious sound had only grown louder when he bashed through the door. Before him was a man splayed against the wall, pants around his ankles, buttocks tight as he humped the wall. In an absurdly delayed reaction, Quid shriveled into the corner, revealing a hole in the wall where he just was. Dyer waved the gun back to himself. "Let's go," Dyer said, ignoring the man's partial nudity. Dyer never seemed to catch anyone at breakfast, kissing their wife goodbye, or even reading a book. No, it was always sexual antics. To Quid's credit, this was rather mild compared to some he had seen before. When Dyer happened upon two heterosexual cyborgs that night, he had nearly forgotten his purpose for the intrusion. The strange array of interlocking parts had disturbed him, even on the next morning, and still the words, machine sex, made him pause with unease. Quid was only startled, as the look on his face revealed that he knew exactly who Dyer was. Before the little man could buckle his belt, Dyer was snatched up by an unseen hand and thrown backwards into the booth across the hall. Dyer crashed through the door and divided a confused and frantic male couple that tried to move as far away from Dyer as the walls allowed. Knowing bigger game was present, Dyer replaced the revolver back into the folds of his coat and retrieved a machine pistol. Fully automatic fire was the only reason for pulling it. As he struggled to stand amongst the particle board and twisted folding chairs, Dyer was retrieved by a cybernetic arm gripping his lapels. The cyborg held Dyer at arm's length and then rammed the griefer with his other fist repeatedly. It sounded as if someone was chopping wood underwater. Dyer retaliated, first spraying the machine pistol empty into everything but his aggressor, and then he butted the cyborg's skull with the gun viciously, but lacked the leverage to do damage against the armor plating beneath the cyborg's skin-like material. Then the cyborg pulled him close and applied a bear hug. His wide, round face grinned as his arms created the force of industrial machinery. The coat could resist some of the pressure and the dull pain as his ribs snapped beneath it, but it would not be long before he was squeezed into a chunky paste. Dyer slipped his other hand into a slit in his coat. Soon after, a stubby shotgun exploded from beneath his garment. Instantly, the cyborg released his grip on Dyer and took a knee, sending the griefer crashing to the floor. Dyer recovered quickly and shoved his gun back into his coat before retrieving the motherless black blade for whose edge was sealed in vestige material, machete-like, flat-tipped. It was similar to its cousin, the spine blade. This weapon was sharpened when pulled from its scabbard. There was no electric crackle when it was unveiled, lacking the instantaneous transfer of vestige in the body to the blade, as it would in an Eater soldier. Dyer was no swordsman, and few of his kind were. The orphan blade made itself known inside the coat a few weeks after it was donned, along with a few other toys. The longer it was worn, the more deadly items appeared, until the wearer was no longer surprised about what his hands pulled out. He swung the weapon like a club, and the downed cyborg parried with his free arm. Then Dyer's eyes caught the results of his desperate sleight with the shotgun. Rushing forward, he allowed his body to roll against the weak counterattack, and swung hard at the exposed calf of the machine man. The blow seemed to have missed, but the black orphan had snagged some cords with the angle at her tip, and with a pop of the insulated wires he was crippled. The actuators in his functioning leg whined as he struggled to stand. Dyer looked down at the man trying to preserve his strange robotic fluids. He could press harder, force this man to submit in the old way, and he would, once Dyer revealed to him just how high a man had to climb to be a bastard child, just for the privilege to war over a misused moniker. His gums were tight, but his teeth were still relatively flat, a lesser son. But the carnage he could invoke would mean more security for those that loved him. Enough blood and panic might equal a mane of his own. It would only increase the gossip attached to his name, but he thought better. especially with the expense of black market cybernetic parts. He pressed a button on his phone, signaling for the EMTs to come remove the cyborg from the scene. Dyer stepped into the booth where Quid had been a few moments earlier, and sniffed inside. He groaned and frowned as the stench was shoved into his nose. Old and fresh sex smells. Then he turned to the wall the little man had been gyrating against, and rubbed the sleeves of his coat against it. He hoped the man had been sweating. It would help if he had not yet taken a shower as well. Almost immediately he could smell Quid, as intensely as if he were right in front of him. He stepped out of the little room to find the shopkeep holding her gun casually. He shrugged and pointed to the cyborg heaving on the deck. "He won't be a problem. The EMTs will be here to pick him up," Dyer said, knowing this man would not be going to a hospital or a repair shop. "Just build my shop. You know the number." She nodded as Dyer hurried past her. He was focused solely on the scent now. He rushed out of the building. His face curled into a sneer as the man's sour scent was pressed firmly in his nasal cavity. Again the crowd parted for him, and no one wanted to get between a griefer and his objective. The rest of the world seemed to melt into a mundane, washed-out tapestry of urban cliches. Taxis surged past him as he battered down endless concrete sidewalks, people leaning on their windowsills yapping on phones and watching the crowd shuffle below. Dyer was invisible, but his presence was felt, and the world moved around him, reacting in accord with his adjustments. The signal-to-noise ratio would increase until there was no difference between a wall and anything else. Only Quid would be visible. Long-Tooth Eater said this was how God saw the world. Dyer was sure that God was a miserable myopic fuck, but the scent, now so strong it pulled him along Quid's path. Dyer's chest felt tight, as if it were being restricted by his clothing, not impeding his movement, just a slight embrace. Closer now. He wiped his mouth with the cuff of his coat, but it was already wet. Perhaps he had wiped it absently before. It was difficult telling much of anything now. There was the beat, the swaying of this mindless gray herd. Singing. The singing was what he heard the most. Ancient. Alien. Before the hunters had eyes. Just shadowy patches that delineated light and dark. And he was far from the end of this carnivorous line. But this work was beneath those of the pride. He was fine skulking beneath the shadows of the gods, as long as he was left to his task without meddling. Watch him work now, those aloft would, certainly down noses and crumpled frowns. What they would see was a lesser brother that excelled without the lady's favor. Perhaps they would raise a brow slightly, pleased and intrigued by the actions of this bit of peasantry that happened to be their kin. The scent took him to the center of the low-rent, high-crime communities populated by those who had given up the chase to keep above the mire of debt that was drowning their society. Everyone had debt, and everyone tried to hide it. It was shameful to speak of your financial troubles, and none did. And when someone dropped out of the tax bracket and moved to lower-end housing, they were barely missed. Why would anyone associate with someone who refused to pull their weight anyway? Quid's scent led Dyer to a building with a group of young boys sitting out front. The boys gazed up at Dyer as if he was someone to be admired. Their fawning disgusted him. If Quid had been any one of their fathers, he would ascend the floors and drag him out just the same, ignoring their pleas. Perhaps, Dyer thought, that maybe none of them had a father. Their eyes were begging for love that he could not give them. His guilt of having a father was greatly outweighed by the guilt of living under a father's reign. And still he believed that guidance was not a laser, that hatred could never be love, but perhaps some understanding, later, when the boy had outlived the father. But never his voice, even now, never allowing himself to slouch. Dyer looked up at the grimy windows of the apartment building. Some held faces briefly, people turning away from their wall displays to catch a bit of street gossip. The stories of griefers were forbidden from being told in the media, and so the horror they invited was passed verbally from corner to corner, half heard and exaggerated over malt liquor and cheap wine on a lazy night. Tales of brutality spun with amusement by the circumstances of a captive society. Dyer looked back to the boys as they shuffled to the other side of the stairs, while never removing their eyes from him. Finally, they remembered their manners and cast their eyes downward. Dyer lifted his chin at the boy who kept looking up at him, shirking the unspoken custom. "This your crew?" Dyer said. The boy sitting highest on the stoop spoke. "Yeah," he said. "Go and get some ice cream or something," Dyer said. The boy threw up his hands. "We ain't got no money," he said. Dyer noticed the filth and the recent scars on the boy's knuckles. "The hell?" Dyer said. "You bullshitting me? Y'all haven't robbed anybody today?" The boys shook their heads. "No," one of them said. Dyer put his hands in his coat. "Don't lie to me. Nobody knocked over any old ladies?" Dyer said. "Nope," another boy said. Dyer pulled out a thick knot of money and began to peel away a few notes. Most children would not have a transfer card, and paper money was the expected currency amongst the common. "Not one purse?" Dyer said, still not convinced of the boy's innocence. After Dyer handed out the pocket money, he watched the boys run down the street and then turned his attention back to the building. He wanted it to be clear if Quid jumped or thought he might be slick and run out, only to be shot in the back. He rushed to the top of the short set of stairs and quickly entered the long key code to get inside the building, every building, and ducked into the elevator. He wondered how anyone got away with anything in the districts, especially when there were so many willing to snitch, pointing the finger of damnation for anyone with a few dollars to rub together.